inspired me, and of course he's one of them. First time I see this class was, I believe, last year. So just a little bio for him, not to embarrass you, sir, but you know how I feel. Damon Fordham was born in Spartanburg, South Carolina, on December 23rd, 1964, to Ann Montgomery, and was adopted by Pearl and Abraham Fordham on Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. The following year, he received his master's degree in the history of college in Charleston and at the Citadel, and his undergraduate degree at the University of South Carolina in Columbia. He is currently an adjunct professor of World Civilizations, United States, and African American History at Charleston Southern University and the Citadel here in Charleston, South Carolina, and has taught U.S. history and African American studies at the College of Charleston. He was a weekly columnist for the Charleston Coastal Times from 1994 to 1998, as well as the author of the 1895 segregation fight in South Carolina, Mr. Ponsonby, Voices of Black South Carolina Legend and Legacies, the True Stories of Black South Carolina, and co-author of Born to Serve, the story of the WBEMC in South Carolina 2006. Needless to say, he got an extensive book career. Research and articles by Mr. Fordham appeared in the books Sweetgrass Baskets and The Gullah Tradition by Josie Coakley, South of Maine by Patrice Hill and Brenda Lee, the Greenwood Encyclopedia of African American Folklore from the University of Missouri Press, and Cecily Williams and Sonny D. Boys, Orangeburg, 1968, and the Malcolm X Encyclopedia for the University of Southern Mississippi Press in 2001. He was also commented on history and storytelling for numerous radio and television programs in the United States, Canada, Japan, and the UK. He was on a 10-day tour of Senegal and Gambia, West Africa, with the fellow educators where he spoke to students at the University of Gambia in May 2022. He also appeared in the NBC LX News in 2022. He conducts a walking tour called The Lost Stories of Black Charleston and has received a citation from the South Carolina House of Representatives for the work in his education, historical research, and social justice. He was also on an educational fact-finding visit to Senegal and Gambia, West Africa, where he toured the slave port at Gora Island and spoke to a class of students at the University of Gambia in Bangkok. His motto is, educate yourself to lead yourself. For if you wait on others to show you the way, you will wait for a long time. Hey, give my man a hand.
Okay. Give Kenya's Boston another hand. Very fine young gentlemen who I taught a couple of years ago. You all in very capable leadership of future leaders such as this young man here. And I'd like to thank you for welcoming me here today, because what I'm going to talk about are things that are not commonly taught in the classroom. Why aren't they taught in the classroom? I'm going to tell you why in a little bit, but I'm not one of these people who you see a lot of now. They're always talking about the problem, but they often leave out something important, and that is the solution. So you're going to hear a little bit about that tonight too. Now, so I also would request that some of you, if you have your phones with you, you might want to record or live stream this, because you're going to hear some stuff tonight that you're not likely to hear anywhere else. So you definitely want to preserve this for yourselves, your younger brothers and sisters, children, etc., and so forth. Okay, so if you want to record all of this, what I'm saying here tonight, you have my permission, go right ahead. And so now let us begin. You see, what often happens nowadays is that people tend to make complicated things too simple and simple things too complicated. And we wind up with a lack of understanding that plays on people's emotions, but very seldom gives them the facts in which they need on how to deal with the matter. You see, ladies and gentlemen, in times of crisis, false prophets do well. And right now, false prophets are doing very well at the time in which we speak. Because you cannot understand why you have a problem unless you understand where that problem originated. Whenever a doctor does surgery, they understand that you cannot find the cure until you find the cause. So we're going to talk a little bit about the cause tonight. and then I'm going to tell you about my recent book and how it relates to all of that, and then we're going to wrap up with the cures as well as a question and answer when this is over, okay? So, here we go. We understand that the problem is the division of the people caused by this thing called racism. And here are some things that you have to understand about that. Now, who in here is a history major? Anybody here is a history major? Very good. Have you heard of Mr. James Henry Hammond, South Carolina? Well, that's okay if you haven't. It's all right. Because James Henry Hammond was a senator in South Carolina back in 1858. Slavery had already been established well into this time. But he said something that talks a lot about why this situation exists. He said that he had what he called the mudsill theory. And what is that? The mudsill theory says that every society has to have a group that is up on top running things, doing the brain work and the figuring things out. And he said they have to have what's called the mudsill, the people who do the hard and dirty work to make that civilization go on. And he went on to say in Congress, fortunately, in the South, we have a race that we use for that purpose. Pretty deep, huh? And in order to keep these people subjugated, you have to limit their educations, limit their possibility, limit their chances of getting ahead in the world. But wait a minute. What about the white? They said they have a race for that purpose. Well, guess what? Many of the poor whites of the South served that same purpose. But they were often misled by weapons of mass distraction. What do I mean by that? In order to make all of this work, the powers that be in the South, the wealthy white class of the planters, they understood that if the poor whites, in their misery, in their subjugation, in their illiteracy, would understand what they had in common with their black brethren, the two of them would come together and overthrow that system that enslaved them both. So in order to prevent that from happening, they gave the poor whites more privileges than the black brethren and encouraged the poor whites to hate, fear, and divide themselves and separate themselves from their black brethren to prevent them from coming together and overthrowing that structure. In simple terms, ladies and gentlemen, divide and conquer of the poor so that the rich could stay rich. That's what racism is all about, Charlie Brown. Simple as that. So after the fall of the Confederacy, you had what was called the Reconstruction era. This period was largely censored from your history books for reasons I'm going to get into in a little while. This was the period from 1865 to 1877 when, in order to reform the Confederacy, the federal government passed 3 constitutional amendments. The 13th in 1865 that ended slavery throughout the country. The 14th in 1868 that said that all persons born here were citizens. And the 15th in 1870 that said that all men born here had the right to vote. Women would get that in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. So you had things that have largely been erased or forgotten. For example, 1872, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. There was the first African-American governor. His name was Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, and he was the founder of Southern University, one of the largest black colleges in America today. Here in South Carolina, from 1870 to 1877, there were 2 black lieutenant governors, Alonzo Jacob Ramsier and Richard Howell Gleaves. Richard Howell Gleaves, who served from 1872 to 1877, he was lieutenant governor under Governor Franklin Moses, making this the first time in American history that you had a black lieutenant governor and a Jewish governor running a state municipality here in South Carolina. And here in Charleston, from January to April of 1868, over at what was then the Charleston Clubhouse, it's now known as the J. Waties Waring Judicial Center, 76 blacks and 48 whites gathered at that building to rewrite the Constitution of South Carolina, to make South Carolina into the most democratic constitution that the country had up to that point. They called for such things as an abolishment of discrimination laws. Women were allowed to divorce abusive husbands. You had state hospitals and mental institutions. My alma mater, the University of South Carolina, from 1873 to 1877, Columbia, during that 4-year period, they were the first and only desegregated school anywhere in the Deep South during the 1800s. They had the first major black professor, Richard T. Greener, whose statue today is right next to the Thomas Cooper Library at University of South Carolina. And on January 23rd, 1868, the great Robert Smalls, ex-slave, who gathered himself and the rest of his enslaved family on a Confederate ship called the Planter in Charleston Harbor and sailed them off into freedom. That's what he's best known for. But guess what? On January 23rd, 1868, the great Robert Smalls got up in that hall and made this declaration: resolved, all children between the ages of 7 and 14 must attend public school at least 6 months a year under penalty of noncompliance. That, ladies and gentlemen, was the first public school law ever passed this far south of the Mason-Dixon line. So why haven't you heard about any of this? Usually when I talk about this, I get 2 questions. Why hasn't anybody told me this before? Or, well, what the heck happened if it started that good? I'm going to answer that. As I said before, the powers that be that ran the state did not want these poor whites and blacks coming together and overthrowing their roof. So, December 24th, 1865, at the courthouse in Pulaski, Tennessee, 6 Confederate veterans gathered to form the Resistance Army Against Reconstruction. They named themselves after the Greek word for circle, which is kuklos, and the Scottish word for family, which is clan. See where that led? That's how the Ku Klux Klan started. And for the next 12 years, the South bathed in blood. Memphis Massacre of 1866, New Orleans Massacre of 1866, Meridian, Mississippi Massacre of 1871, Colfax, Louisiana Massacre of 1874, Clinton, Mississippi Massacre of 1875, Hamburg, South Carolina Massacre of 1876, the Ellington, South Carolina Massacre of 1876, and 146 years ago, November the 8th, 1876, over on Broad Street in downtown Charleston, blacks and whites shot it out in the middle of the street. You notice how I just said that? Blacks and whites shot it out in the middle of the street. You see, I always tell you that the worst places that you can get your history are Hollywood and the internet. And if you listen to that stuff, they'll have you believe that black people never lifted a finger in their own defense and stayed in church and did nothing but cry and pray until Malcolm X and Martin Luther King came along. Think again. Whenever there was oppression throughout human history, there has been resistance. And the story that I'm about to tell you is a major one of that resistance. So, with all this bloodshed in the South, the North said, yo, this is too much. Man, we can't deal with this. The South wouldn't do right if its last name was right. So they passed on February 26, 1877, the Tilden-Hayes Compromise that ended Reconstruction in the South. And that led to a slow reversal of the rights of black people in order to maintain that permanent class of cheap labor and division. And then later on in this, the Daughters of the Confederacy under Mildred Rutherford in Georgia and through the efforts of Mary Sims Oliphant here in South Carolina, the Daughters of the Confederacy removed all mention in the history books about much of what I just told you and rewrote history to say that slavery had nothing to do with Confederacy. And the average person knows primarily what they are told. So generations of people were told, it's not about hate, it's about heritage, because that's what they were told. And oftentimes, when you give truth to a people who have never known truth, in the words of TLC in that song, Creep, they just can't handle it. And so that's part of the problem that you have right now. So, with all this going on, it led to scenarios that what happened with my great-grandfather, James Buchanan Maxwell, who was born in Flat Rock, North Carolina in 1856 in slavery. He graduated from the Avery Institute over on Bull Street in 1873, was the first black notary public in this area, was a teacher. He had a general store up in the 4 Mile section of Mount Pleasant. And he was brought in with a group of men in that area on November the 12th, 1879, on the trumped-up charges of voting while illiterate. And I tell the story about it in this book. And many of those men were, in fact, illiterate. But when he got up on that stand, they tried that mess on him. He told the court over and over, I can read, I can read, I can read. And they let him go. And I found the court documents that told that story that has been in my family for generations. And in fact, yesterday I spent some time in that actual courthouse, and I somehow managed to keep a dry eye in the midst of all of that. But as this thing went down, you had a man named Benjamin Ryan Tillman, who was the senator of South Carolina, and he was known for his brutality toward African Americans. While he was governor, he sent an African American down in Denmark, South Carolina, named John Peterson, to the hands of a lynch mob. During the hurricane of 1893, he refused to give black people allotments to rebuild. And in the words of Forrest Gump, for those of you who've seen that movie, boy, did he love that and word. And this and and that. Horrible human being. So he proposed to maintain that permanent class of cheap labor, to rewrite the Constitution, to throw out all the progressive Reconstruction laws, and make segregation and the denial of black voting rights the law of the state. Now again, if you listen to a lot of people who don't know what they're talking about, they'll tell you that black people didn't lift a finger during all this. That's a lie. 6 black South Carolinians, Robert Smalls, who I just discussed, Thomas Miller, the founding president of South Carolina State University, William J. Whipper, a black lawyer on Broad Street, James Wigg and Isaiah Reed, 2 black lawyers from Beaufort, South Carolina, and Robert Anderson, a black teacher from Georgetown. These brave men went to the State House during the time they were voting on this. And before the newspapers of the world let the world know that the black South Carolinians were not going to just roll over and let this happen. And what kind of things did they say? Well, let me give you a small example of this. Thomas Miller, the founding president of South Carolina State, said this before the South Carolina legislature. Call us aliens, we aliens, the people who are the foundation of the American civilization, aliens, a people who by their sweat assisted into clothing the barren rocks of the northeast in Bendu, who drained the swamps of the south and made them to mimic gold in harvest time, who by their endurance and trial and suffering made it possible for our white neighbors to establish this government, the asylum of it all, who by their toil established the canal and railroad systems of this country. You call us aliens, then to whom, I ask, can the term citizens apply? That's in 1895, when around 70% of African Americans were illiterate. This man is getting up there in the State House saying things like that. And then you had the great Robert Smalls. This is what he had to say about this. And these words are on his gravestone in Beaufort, South Carolina, I may add. My race has honored me with a seat on this floor, and I shall serve them to the best of my ability. My race needs no special defense, for their past history in the country proves them to be equal of any people, anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life. I am proud of them and their acts toward me. I know that they are not ashamed of me, for they have at all times honored me with their votes. William J. Whipper, African American on Broad Street. This is what he had to say. This convention is about to make a great mistake in not giving the Negro latitude. The car of Negro progress is coming. Instead of allowing it to come on, you wish to stop it. You may as well just make up your minds that the Negro will rise. We will not be crushed. The Negro will rise. Sooner or later, crush us as you may. We, the Negroes, with our perseverance and our pluck, will and must come out. We cannot be kept down forever, for it is not in the nature of human affairs. November 1st, 1895. And as all this is going on, let's down in Tuskegee, Alabama, Booker T. Washington, the great educator who helped found Tuskegee University. And I've been there, and I can tell you that's one of the best historically black colleges and universities I've ever visited. I used to take kids on tours there. Booker T. Washington said this to Benjamin Ryan Tillman. He went on to say primarily that, "Honored sir, do not misunderstand me. I am not selfish as to make this appeal in the interest of my embrace alone. For thank God a white man is as near to my heart as a black man. But I appeal to you in the interest of humanity. Whatsoever a man soweth, that he shall reap." And he prophesied that if the African Americans of South Carolina were kept in illiteracy, in ignorance, in poverty, then that would mean that while the whites were keeping them in that position, the whites would also stay in illiteracy and poverty, because you cannot hold a man down in the ditch without getting dirty yourself. And when we look at the literacy rates of South Carolina, even to this day, and South Carolina's place in education throughout the nation, that man was prophesizing. He knew what he was talking about. Well, the final vote came on December the 4th, 1895. And these men's defense was so strong that the vote against them was not as unanimous as you would think. Two white delegates, T.E. Dudley out of Marlborough, South Carolina, and John Halston Reed out of Georgetown, South Carolina. They both appealed to their white brethren that if you put this unfair constitution as law, the wrath of the federal government will come down on this, and if you start cheating black people out of their votes, you're going to soon start cheating white people. And I say that because so often nowadays the argument against teaching of this history is used, that this stuff is going to make white people feel bad about themselves. Not if you teach it right. Because the history of America is filled with anti-racism also. There were many white people, such as Viola Liuzzo, the lady who was killed in Selma, Alabama, for helping Martin Luther King help African Americans to vote. Her daughter Sally, in fact, is a very good friend of mine. There was Elijah Lovejoy in Alton, Illinois, who was killed for his defense of black people during slavery. You had Mr. Julius Waties Waring, a white judge over on Broad Street, who was run out of Charleston in 1952 for trying to legalize voting for African Americans around here. And I could go on with that. But the point of that is, that goes to show that the people who make that argument, that if you're going to make that argument, know what you're talking about, okay? In other words, as I often tell those of you who have been in my class before, go by what I call the 3 F's. Fight the foolishness with the facts, okay? So, even though they were defeated, and I'm going to save this part for those of you who want to buy and read the book, because the book is out there, even in the failure of this to pass, this laid the foundation for the civil rights movement to come. They may have lost that battle, but as my book will tell you, they wound up eventually winning the war, even though they did not live to see that. But in order for that war to be completely won, you have to stay vigilant about these things. You have to be aware of what's around you, and always work about not just complaining about what you're going through right now, but be solution-oriented, okay? Now, nowadays, you have a lot of places that are banning this kind of history, right? So what are some people doing? They're going to the internet. Ladies and gentlemen, let me say this about that. I just said a little bit earlier that 2 of the worst places that you can go for your history are Hollywood and the internet, okay? There are some good things on the internet, but as we see by the ridiculous events of last January the 6th, a lot of adults do not know how to separate the truth from the trash online. So you got to use the next best alternative, ladies and gentlemen. There are these places called libraries, filled with these things with books that are peer-reviewed by people before they can get on those shelves. Your best bet is to go to the library and ask for good books on these particular subjects. And those of you who are watching this who are parents, go to the library and ask for age-appropriate books for your young children. So if they ban this stuff from the schools, you will have this stuff next to it. And once you get a good understanding of these situations, spread what you learn. Have teachings, have community meetings, go online yourself, go to where the people are, and bring this in the language that they could understand. Because as a wise man named J.E. Esselmont said 100 years ago, the aim of the true teacher is to teach the student how to do without the teacher. And let me close with this. You heard from the introduction that I was in Africa over the summer. And one of the things that I did while I was over there, we had an audience with Dr. Ousame Sene in Dakar in Senegal. He's a professor at the University of Dakar, as well as he's over the West African Research Center in the capital city of Dakar. And we had a good audience with him. For a while, he taught at Wofford College in my birthplace of Spartanburg, South Carolina. And he said that when he was through teaching them and had to come back to Africa, the students up there begged him, Dr. Sene, please stay here and teach us, because we're not getting the stuff that you're teaching us from anywhere else. Please stay and teach them some more. And he said, no. He said, my job is done, and I have to go back to my people in Senegal, West Africa, because guess what? I have given you the tools to find out the kind of things that I have taught you. It is up to you to use those tools and take it to move forward. So that's what I'm saying to you right now. Once you go and understand and learn these things, every great leader, from Shirley Chisholm, who I had the opportunity of meeting once, to Martin Luther King, to Medgar Evers, to Ralph Abernathy, to Adam Clayton Powell, to Frederick Douglass, to Malcolm X, to numerous other people in our history, every great leader has read instructions. So in the same way that when you go to church and the preacher tells you about Abraham and Joshua and Elijah and Ezekiel and Jesus Christ and Peter and Paul and the rest of them, so that the teachings that they had back then can be used by you to make your life better now, study those instructions left behind by great leaders so that you could take those teachings and move forward. And now that we have given you those tools to take that, my closing advice to you is take those tools and use them and move forward. Thank you. So at this time, ladies and gentlemen, I would appreciate if you have any questions, feel free to come up. I'd be more than happy to answer them for you. So let's go.
All right, Professor Fordham, I have a question for you. So, you spent all this time, all these years doing a lot of research. You've seen from different times how racism's kind of changed forms. So for us as young people today, what do you think that looks like? Obviously, it's not as easy as simple as, somebody disrespecting you probably out on the street. But what are ways do you see that today? What are ways that would you give to us here that we should go about reacting to those things as well as learning from those things and changing those things today?
Martin Luther King said it best in its last book, Where Do We Go From Here, which is an excellent source of instruction for you young people who are activists. He said that whenever you deal with an adversary, you must be as gathered in knowledge as your opponents. In other words, look and see what the people who are opposed to you are doing and thinking. And as you listen to them, study these people whose speeches you don't like, whose YouTube videos that you don't like and so forth. And when you study them, you can get together, just like how you all are organizing right now. You get together and discuss these ideas and organize and read some of these wise teachings that I told you about. Because let me give you an example of this, okay? Who here has heard of Marcus Garvey? I'm glad to see that some of you have, all right? Well, you know, Marcus Garvey preached the unity of African people and the building of a power base in Africa 100 years ago, back in the 1920s, okay? And so in Kenya, in West, you're from Kenya, aren't you? Well, all right. Well, you're going to love what I'm about to tell you right now, okay? In Kenya, back in the 1920s, the Kikuyu and the Luo tribesmen would be out in the remote areas with somebody who would read Marcus Garvey's teachings out of the Negro World newspaper. And he would have these runners to go out into the remotest areas and repeat the teachings of Marcus Garvey so that all the villagers could hear them out in Kenya. And Kenya was not only, doesn't make you feel good to hear that? Well, all right. So basically that would spread the teachings of Marcus Garvey not only through the villages of Kenya, but throughout Africa. Well, guess what happened? Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta of your nation, Kenya, and Nelson Mandela, as well as Ezekwe down in Nigeria, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, and other such leaders, they took what Marcus Garvey had to say on the next level, and guess what they did? Each of these men liberated their nations. And guess what? Marcus Garvey himself never set foot in Africa. But through his teachings and through his words, he wound up inspiring people to go and liberate Africa to where even in the remotest parts of Senegal and Gambia over the summer, there were murals of Marcus Garvey, and I met people who could quote Marcus Garvey chapter and verse just like out of the Bible. So this is why I tell you it's so important that you study the teachings of wise leaders, because that's the kind of place where they can get you. Next question. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Brock, come on down here and use the mic. I'm live streaming this. I want people to hear this. Can y'all go and help this man, okay? Help him out, man.
So I know you've been studying Black history for a while now. What is the biggest challenge that you've seen that you faced studying Black history?
Well, I'd say that some of my biggest challenges are right now, because right now I just said earlier that leave it on. Okay. Good question, by the way. One of the biggest challenges I have right now is that earlier I said that in times of crisis, false prophets do well. Right now on the internet, because there are so few people who have a real understanding of this history, you have these frauds out there on YouTube, out there making a mockery of our history and playing on the emotions of our people with misinformation to get rich. You have this one clown up there talking about how Africans were here before the Native Americans and all of that, and that we were never in Africa. You have people who are saying that we were never enslaved and all this stuff. And you have this one guy who raised all this money for this phony school that was never really built. And you just have all this nonsense out there. And these guys are getting on these YouTube fights right now. The one guy who's talking all this misinformation about this past, he got into an assault and battery thing with this other internet character. And so the both of them are making hay on that. You see, this kind of stuff that you see going on right now, ladies and gentlemen, it's not just the right-wingers that are doing this stuff. Right now, there's this time of mass confusion in America, and it's like you have Ray Charles as the general leading an army of Stevie Wonders. So this is why you have to prove yourself wise and approved and study and know how to use primary sources. Whenever you hear anybody give you any kind of fact, go. Now, most of y'all here have been taught how to use primary sources. Use cross-referencing and primary sources. Years ago, there was a cowboy show called Gunsmoke back in the day that the Colonel and some of you over here remember, right? And there was a guy on there named Festus. Now, Festus couldn't read and write, but in spite of the fact that he was illiterate, he was wise. So the doctor in the show used to always kid him about his illiteracy, saying, man, you know, you need to know how to read and you can learn something. And Festus one time said, but Doc, how you know the fellow who wrote the reading right? And this is what you have to do. You have to, whatever you hear, don't just let people play on your emotions. Study what you've been told to see if it is correct, and know yourselves how to separate the good stuff from the junk. Hope that helps. Anybody else? Anybody else?
Not a question, but do come to the library.
Hey,
We're happy to help.
excuse me. Come on the microphone so people can hear you. Because you got a lot of people around the country watching this, and they need to hear this too. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to echo. They didn't. Let's see. I was going to say, please echo what he said earlier. Please come to the library. We're happy to help you find information. And for primary resources, Sue Tessa, she's our archivist.
But thank you. I appreciate that. Excellent job. Excellent. Yeah, they need to hear that. Okay. Do I have any others before we? Yes. Who's that? Oh, Amanda, come on up. Professor Amanda Mushal, come on up. Yeah. Because I want people to hear what you have to say.
Thank you for. Is this on? No, it's not.
I'll tell you what, Amanda, here.
All right.
There you go.
Thank you.
All right.
And thank you for this. You're talking about primary sources, and I have some of my students here from the methods class in particular. What were some of the most interesting sources that you got into in researching this book? You knew I was going to do that to you.
Actually, I didn't know you were going to ask me that. But since you asked, I'm glad you did, because I'm happy to answer that question. And the answer to that is, years ago, I was reading a book called Lift Every Voice, which was a collection of African-American speeches from 1797 till 1901. And I found Thomas Miller's speech about Call Us Aliens. And when I learned that during this period when they were segregating the state, that these men stood up against that, I said, whoa, man, this is some interesting stuff. I need to learn more about this. So you see, there was a time when I worked for microfilm at the Charleston County Library that used to be on King Street before they tore that down and built a new one. And I went through these old newspapers and found this amazing story of how these 6 brave men fought to save their people's voting rights and so forth, and how that would lead to the civil rights movement that was to come. So anyway, I talked about it in a chapter in my book, Voices of Black South Carolina, which is also available out there. But I decided that the story was just too important, and I expanded it into this book, the 1895 the segregation fight in South Carolina, that I'll be happy to sign for you out there if you're interested. And because you see, Malcolm X, when he gave a speech in Los Angeles on May the 5th, 1962, he said that you could never do anything unless you realized that you did anything. And so many people have the misconception that, you know, there are people right now who are making our history look like we were so powerless, like we were just completely under the thumb of others, and that we had no real allies or anything like that from other races. You have these people who try to make our history sound as miserable as possible because they feel that that will radicalize the people into doing something. I say 2 words to that, and the first word is bull. And I'll tell you why I say that. Because if you give a people no hope of any kind of change, they will not want to do anything. You have to let them know that they have had a history where they have had some successes and some fight as well as failures, so that they can learn to build on what was successful and avoid that which has failed. So that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. Okay? All right, well, if there are no more questions, I will turn this back over to Mr. Kenyas Boston. And if you're interested in any of my books, or if you have other questions, I'll be at the table out there to sign it. But Again, I thank you for allowing me to come before you, and I hope that all of this proves to be inspiring to you and that you will learn as much as you can. And because let me tell you this, myself, Professor Michal, and Ms. Updike and the rest of these adults who are in Colonel Pickering in this room and all of that, let me close on this note with you folks. We are all either teachers or administrators here, but you know what? We have one thing in common with all of you students out there. As long as we live and breathe on this earth, we're always going to be students of life. Thank you.
Definitely pretty a lot of good information. Mr. Fordham, on behalf of us, I'll let you.